Today in the garage, we're going to leave the Ford stuff to the Ford and the Nissan stuff to the Nissan, as we are going to change the ignition system on our supercharged KA from a Ford wasted spark system to a more modern Nissan coil on plug setup. Honestly, anytime I'm using the word modern with this thing, it's mostly vague. It's hard to believe that this car is now 30 years old. I lose that sense of scale sometimes because the truck, being a 67, we're talking 50 years old, and that sounds so archaic. But this car is closer to age to that than this car is to modern times. So although this car is, of course, much more modern, there's still a lot in here that is archaic. Now, of course, this is no stock 240SX. It has the supercharged setup on it. It has a Mega Squirt custom computer, but it turns out that the ignition system that is going with that Mega Squirt system is a little bit outdated. And I have always found it to be something that limits this car's potential, and it limits its ability to be reliable. It's a part of the link of this car that is being strained. That coil over there is being worked to its absolute maximum in order to keep up with the amount of pressure that this engine is making. This is a high compression engine with a direct roots blower on it. So we're talking a lot of pressure to try to get a spark. And I have fought, as well as the previous kind of creator of this setup fought, issues with spark blowout. Now, to solve that, I've done what most, tuners basically that deal with forced induction do, and that is narrow down the gap on the spark plug until you start to get rid of your issues with the spark blowing out. That comes with its own set of problems, though, because as you narrow that gap down, your idle quality starts to decrease, and there's a whole bunch of other reasons why I want to go to coil on plug with this engine. That will cover as we go. Now, I never wanted to get into this because I was a little spooked. I don't like to take running cars and do something that could potentially not make them run anymore. That's one of those things that I limit my creativity, and I limit what I could potentially do with things like this because of that. But in this case, I've got some help. I've got many internet, threads and posts and all sorts of research that goes into doing things like this. But mostly ZK, our co-host on Random Parks, that show, is primarily guiding me through this and will be helping us out. Getting parts these days is a challenge on itself, but I have already obtained the 4 coils, the 4 pigtails for these coils, as well as some resistors and some hookup wire that will be necessary for this change. There is some other things that we will need. I've also gotten some new wire loom wrap, because what I'm going to do is wire up this system and get this system working without interfering with the current ignition system. So everything that is in here to do with the current ignition system will stay. And a brief little history lesson there. The coil that you see there, it is part of an EDIS Ford system, and you can see the EDIS4 computer over there. This is a standalone ignition system. The Mega Squirt is not directly in charge of the ignition of this vehicle. This computer over here is essentially handling that. Of course, I could change timing and things like that, but for the most part, that's doing all the work. Down there at the crank, you will see that this engine has a custom tooth crank pulley on it that is not factory, and there is a small magnetic pickup down there as well to go with that. Those are all basically existing Ford parts, and all of that is a very standard and typical Mega Squirt ignition system. So currently we have a coil back there that is providing spark to the 4 individual cylinders through standard spark plug wires. We are intending to ditch those and use these, which are an NGK reproduction of a coil off a Nissan Maxima from the year 2000. The year 2000. I can open this box. It's always easier from the bottom, right? So in there we have ourselves a nice brand new coil. I always trust NGK stuff. It's always done me pretty well. This is, believe it or not, going to be a direct fit for this engine, even though these coils did not go to this engine ever. These coils were featured on the V6 engine in the Maxima, and we have used 4 of them from the same bank, so they all have this same back-facing connector for the use in this engine, and they will slide in, they'll connect to the spark plug, and then snap right into place. They have a suction mount around the spark plug ring, basically, on the valve cover, and they will sit right there. In most cases on a coil unplugged setup, you'll have a piece of metal that bolts all these together. In our case, that's not going to be necessary, but we may end up doing that later on just to kind of fancy it up. The next part of that puzzle, these are pigtails. I decided to go for pigtails rather than going for pin it yourself style connectors. And these have 3 leads on them. These coils are smart enough to be driven by just these 3 wires because all we need is power, ground, and signal. Don't quote me on which one is which in there, I just listed them off. But the pigtail will connect right there, and that is the entirety now of the wiring system for the ignition system. A lot less going on than the old school stuff over there. So what I need to do right now is get these 4 coils mounted and then get the pigtails on there and basically just see where the wiring is going to need to go. The way that these work best is if you have the ground grounded to the head of the engine. So that's pretty simple. These 4 wires will go into one that will go into a nice ground, which there's already a ground post on the head. Makes it nice and easy. And then the other 2 wires, one for power, one for signal, will go down into the inside of the car where the ECU is. And I also have a power board, basically a power distribution board down there in order to power these. So I haven't really mentioned what the advantage is. I say that the old system is kind of underpowered and being overworked. Why are these better? Well, these not only have a greater actual power level to them, they produce a stronger spark. We're also going to be converting from wasted spark into basically a individual ignition system. So with the way that this older system worked, it's kind of, well, dumb. It's not very tuned. It's going to batch fire these coils, these coil leads. So it can only do 2 at a time, and it can't really decipher the difference between the compression stroke or the exhaust stroke. So it is actually firing these 2 on 1 cylinder of compression and 1 cylinder of exhaust at the same time. There is the wasted part. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that it is wasteful or, using extra power or anything like that. It is, however, making the coil do a lot more work than is necessary. But that is a system that is tried and true. Ford used it for many years, and we're quite successful at it. In fact, they were able to make this system work for their modular V8s, for all sorts of their engines, and it did just fine. We've come to the conclusion that it's time to have the ignition system just grow up a little. So this will allow us to have individual coil on-plug control that will also allow us to move away from using fuel cut as a limiter. With this setup, I have never been able to take this engine near redline because the ramifications of hitting the rev limiter could have been rather bad. There's boost in this engine, there's a lot of heat in this engine. We are using a rather rich tune. However, with a fuel-only cut, there is always that little bit of a chance that right at high RPM and high load, we could see this engine get leaned out very badly. You don't really want an engine to be sitting on fuel cut for very long. The much safer way to do things is to have fuel and spark cut. So that way, whenever it's trying to limit the RPM, it is not just going to be turning the injectors off, it will also turn the individual spark plugs off for that non-fire event in order to limit the engine speed. Now begins the process of creating a coil subloom. We're going to need power, ground, and signal, starting with the ground circuit, with all four terminating into a factory head ground location. And of course, using only the finest tools and equipment available, as many times as it takes to eventually work. Remember kids, don't do drugs, but always heat your heat shrink tubing. All four ground wires from the Pigtails are merged into one main ground wire, replicating a sequence I'm familiar with Nissan factory looms. As the effects of age and soldering smoke take their toll on me, I've labeled all the coil connectors to make sure I keep the wires the correct length for each coil. When it comes to the signal and power wires, I'm using a length of wire to determine the longest possible route from the ECU and power boards to the furthest away coil, and then using 5 unique wires cut to suit. My supply of wire is limited, so I am using 16 gauge wire for the 4 unique signal wires, which may end up being too large of a wire for the low 5-volt circuit. We'll have to see if that signal is clear later on. After wrapping the sub-harness in a split nylon loom, it's ready for wiring into the ECU and power circuits. So our subloom is now done with the coils all in place and the wire run into the car. We're ready to move on to the part where we need to pin new connections into the ECU. We need to change a lot of connections within inside of the ECU, and we need to secure a proper power location for the coils to draw from. The big thing here is that we need to hook up those 4 signal wires into the ECU, and we're going to use the 4 spare pins on the ECU. They are literally called the spare pins on the Megasquirt MS2 3.0 that we are using. I did label and write down which ones are which: light blue, orange, dark blue, and yellow. And those 4 need to go into individual pins, but the wires I used are way too big to be pinned, so I'm going to use some hookup wire to make some basically pigtails to go to these, and I did test them, and I tested the resistance of of the entire wire to the connector. That seems like it's going to be fine, but it's something I'll keep in mind in the future if we end up with an issue where like the coils aren't receiving signal. There is, however, one thing we need to do in the engine bay yet, and that is I'm going to run a new signal wire. Signal wire? We just ran 4 signal wires. No, this is the pickup for the timing. So I've gotten a new pigtail for the magnetic pickup down by the crank, and a length of, this is actually heavy duty microphone wire because it is 2-wire shielded cable, and this needs to be a heavily shielded connection because this is a very sensitive bit of electricity heading to the ECU. If it gets radio signal or other trace, ignition signals and stuff, it can really mess up how the ECU is reading the timing. It's basically just a magnetic pickup, and you're getting that little sawtooth reading as the notches on that crank pass by that magnetic pickup, and it's just a very faint signal, and you need it to be really clear. So we're going to give this a try and hope that it works. This actually looks a little bit more shielded and nice than the wire that's on there now. The difference is that previously that pickup was going into the ignition computer. Honestly, how the ECU is reading that, or if it is at all, I'm not sure. It may not be. Again, I don't really know or understand that. I don't know that the ECU actually currently knows engine position. That's above my pay grade. But all I know is currently it's going to the Ford ignition system. We're gonna bypass that and hook this up into the actual ECU. Let's first make sure this is the right pigtail. So this will be all that is remaining. Oh, front main seal leaks are fantastic. If you're a KA owner out there, you know this life. They never seal. This is the 4th main seal I've had on this car. All right, that seems correct. Pigtail, pig fail. As I was trying to hook it up to the wire, I just gave it a nice little tug to see if my connection was good, and the wire pulled right out of the plug, and the pin itself just disintegrated. So I guess I'm moving on to using the one that's on the car. I pulled back this messy shielding, and I could see that, yeah, this is a very similar shielded wire here. As you can see the metal shielding, and then, yeah, it's just connected here. Unfortunately, used electrical tape, and I hate electrical tape because it does that. It, especially with any oil contact, just turns into this goopy, awful mess. Heat shrink, my dude. I'm just as guilty as anyone for doing stuff like this, though. Sometimes you got what you got, you just want to get something done. I mean, I'm a perfect example right now. Instead of ordering a new pigtail and waiting another 4 or 5 days to continue this project, I'm going to cut this one off and try to use it. This one was white to white, white to black. That's nice and easy to remember. Snippy, snippy. All right, with the new signal wire made with the old pigtail, and I've double shielded the side of it, we are good to run this into the engine bay and into the car itself. Should be a pretty straightforward process, he says, before something goes wrong. Now you may be asking, why run all these separate wires and harnesses? Why not loom all of these together as you would do in a regular, engine harness? And the reason that I'm doing it this way is because I wanted, like I said earlier, to keep everything intact as far as how the car is running currently. All right, I need to make sure this is away from anything hot. Let's see. And the plan is, if I can get this working correctly, that this sub-harness would no longer be a thing, and I would actually make an entire new engine harness for this car. That would be the ultimate goal here. But that said, I also don't want to make this low quality. I want this to be something that's functional and usable on, a pretty long-term basis for now, as we decide if this is indeed the way we want to go with it. All right, that should be a wrap on everything in the engine bay. and we should be ready to move on to the actual ECU and power hookup sides of this thing. Today is the day, everybody. Today is the day I drive ZK insane, because we are going to be redoing the wiring harness and the ECU for setting up this sequential ignition system. And there is not a small amount of modification that we need to do here. Luckily, Grant, the original creator of this setup, left me with very great documentation as to what he did and the resources he used in order to hook everything up. So I have all these printed diagrams of the previous wiring harness, ignition system, and all of that. ZK has gone through and made me spreadsheets and drawings as far as how to hook up the new system. So very quickly here, I'm not going to drag you through the process too much of me actually doing the wiring and doing the ECU modifications and stuff like that, but just a quick overview of what we're doing here. So this is the previous ECU pinout. On here, you can see we have some things that aren't exactly in the way that this one's set up, because this one is using this secondary computer, basically is what I'm going to call it, for ignition. Here's the gist of what I need to do. Spare 1, 2, 3, and 4 are going to become our new Spark A, B, C, and D. Those are for those 4 wires that we have on the coils that are basically their wake-up signal. So those all need to be pinned. You'll remember I used spare 1 for launch control previously. We'll get back to that. Other modification is previously there is a shielded ground going to number 2. I'm going to be using number 2 for the new, that microphone cable that we're using for the pickup. That'll be the new shield. We're going to put the VR negative on ground number 1, and then on number 24, which I just drove ZK nuts on, because as I was reading this, I was reading the number 20, and then 21, 22, 23, and 24, and I was like, this doesn't match up. What's going on? Well, yeah, I was reading the number 20 and then starting at 21. That's not right. So 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. 24 is the previous basically TAC signal for the ECU coming out of this guy. So that one now needs to become the positive off of that VR switch, off of the reluctor on the front. The only other thing that we're going to do is on pin 36. Previously, that was the ignition module and coil. That is no longer going to be a thing because we are using individual coils with their own circuit, basically. So that is going to become our new launch control circuit, if all goes well. Inside of the ECU, there is quite a bit that needs to go on in here. Let me zoom you in. If you watched the launch control video, you'll remember this area of the ECU. If not, you'll see it in a moment. But this CK drew out as the area of the board that I need to do modifications to. So I actually need to go in and remove all the stuff that I added before, which is a nuisance, but it shouldn't be too terribly bad. We are now adding 4 circuits for the coil drive, basically. So we're going to be using the 5-volt power source and the ground as well. And in here will be Spark A, Spark C, Spark B, Spark D, and they're going over here to D14, D15, and D16 as, I don't know how to describe it better than as signal sources for this circuit. So we need to add some resistors in here, 4.7K, 4 of them, all getting 5 volts power, and then a transistor down here, one of the 3-prong guys, and that needs a 1K resistor on it, and that goes off to JS11. You remember our time with JS11, JS10 over there previously. None of this is too terribly crazy, but it's a lot of work on the board, and like I said, I don't want to drag you through all of it, so I'm going to get to work on that, as well as I need to make new pins for the ECU for 1 through 4. I need to back out the 24 pin and the 2 pin, and then make the ground for 1 and 2 and the new VR positive for 24. That is what I'm going to get to now. I don't know how much of that I'm going to end up recording. I'll get some of it so you can see some of the tears and sad expressions on my face as I mess things up, and hopefully some positive in the end. Did I get nicer wire strippers before doing this? No. No, I did not. Did I get a new soldering iron for this? Yes. Yes, I did. That's the primary thing I've been waiting on. I'm tired of that old, crappy, blunt-tipped soldering iron. Like I said, if you missed the launch control video, you would have seen these. These are the pins that go into the DB37, DB37 connector. And it's just a process of getting these primary wires into these pins, then using these special crimpers to crimp down. I hope that just got caught on video. The spring just popped off of these pliers and it is gone. Like, it just went so far. I hope these will still work without, yeah, they're just a little bit more annoying to use. Oh, that is such my luck. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I found the spring, everybody. I found the spring. Our luck's turning around. All right, so I've got the pins made on those cables. The VR sensor, the pickup, the magnetic pickup in there needs its own pins made. And the working conditions in here are not fantastic, so I haven't been doing a lot of filming in here. But here's what it's looking like right now. A nightmare. Well, only kind of. This is that mic cable from before, and you can see what I've done is stripped away the 2 wires and the shielding, and then put that shielding all together into one clump that could be pinned, and those all need to go into our ECU connector there. The big reason that I want to eventually do a new harness is that in patching this stuff in, that harness gets less and less organized. It gets less nicely bound together, and it'd just be nice to start from scratch. But that's a future goal. For now, I need to get pins on those, and I need to back out the other pins that were in there and put in the new pins. Pin, 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 pin. Okay, we are at a pretty big mile marker for this project here, and that is I have all of the coils wired up. They are set to signal power and ground. It is time to turn on the key and see if this number 1 coil that I have plugged in goes up in smoke, overheats, or does nothing, which is basically what we want. We want it to do nothing. All right, now we actually have power, and no smoke is coming out of the coil. And that means it's ECU time. The hat's on backwards, ZK. It means it's tuning time.
Oh yeah.
I can't tell you how many times doing this I've forgotten to hook in that vacuum line to the ECU, just because it's not, like, logical.
Why is it running like crap?
Oh, it does bad things. I drove it all the way to my parents' house one day with it like that, and I was just, like, flabbergasted.
Okay, continue.
We have EDIS multi-spark, basic trigger, trigger return, toothed wheel, 420A neon, 36
Okay,
two.
so we're gonna want tooth wheel, so that's ignition input, basically.
Ignition input capture, which is set to falling edge. Spark output, which is set to going high. Number of coils, single coil.
Yeah, we're gonna want
Coil.
that to be multi-coil.
Says coil unplug, which I've selected.
So one is connected,
One is connected.
and that is spark A.
Right.
So turn on, or I assume you burned the
Well,
image. Or,
I haven't burned it yet because it's got to be on.
Okay. Well, turn it on and go make sure the coil isn't heating up.
That didn't sound great.
What was that?
I don't know. Okay. I think I know what's going on. It's going to take me a second to change it. I changed around some of these settings, or some of the wires, to give the coil as much power as possible. And I think maybe it's tripping the relay because it's got like back feed or something.
And everyone was like, "Oh, the top is different" or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But according to Nissan, this is on a Pathfinder wiring diagram. It's saying pin 1 is the ECU signal. Well, yeah, that is different than what that is. So it's saying pin 1 is ECU. Based off that connector, that would be the top pin. Well, the bottom pin. 12 volt.
So it's saying we have power and signal switched, right?
Yes.
That could not be harder to switch.
I'm aware. And then I think if you tab through the settings, I don't know when it... Unless it's firing or trying to fire already as soon as you've done that.
I don't see nothing happening.
Is the coil getting hot?
The coil has let out smoke.
Did it really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Very faint wisp and a distinct mark on the side of it.
Easiest fix is just to replace the pigtails.
Yep. We got a burnt coil.
What?
Yep. Same exact situation as before. So, as I'm sure you could tell through that last sequence there, this experiment has not quite gone to, I won't even say to plan, it just hasn't worked out. We were trying something that I considered to be an experimental setup, and we've reached a conclusion that it is not going to work for our application. It's not a total loss, though. We are still going to do an ignition system upgrade, but we just have to do something that's a little bit different. So the main problems we ran into have to do with the fact that the Megasquirt ECU that I'm using essentially doesn't support Coil Unplug natively. So we were trying to add in some additional circuits for it and use other systems within the computer to try to make it work. ZK had found information from other people that were doing things like that. There was some documentation about ways to do it through Megasquirt manuals and things like that, but in the end, however, that didn't end up working. So whenever we tried to turn on Coil Unplug within the ECU, it would throw an error and say, you've got bad configuration. But it would never tell us what the bad configuration was. We could never get it to output anything. We couldn't figure out anything that was logical as to what it was. We ended up burning the coils because the only other option was to leave it in wasted spark mode and just see if it would drive the coils individually. And for whatever reason, even after we rewired them the correct way, despite being told to wire them the wrong way, after that, it was always sending 5 volts of signal source to spark A. And basically what that means is it had infinite dwell. And dwell is how long it will send a signal to the coil to build power. And that overheats them and cooks them. What we think the issue there is that it just wasn't configured. Like, we don't have the wiring configured right for a wasted spark setup, like the setting we were having to use in order just to get a tune to burn to the ECU. What it was looking for Coil Unplug, I've done some research on my own, trying to dig up some resources on this. It seems like the only way with this setup you could have Coil Unplug is if it had a cam signal and a crank signal. It needs to know where the engine is in the 4-stroke cycle, not just within the kind of generic rotational cycle of the engine. It needs to know where every cylinder is, compression versus exhaust, basically. So with that, the computer didn't have enough information because we don't have a cam angle sensor on this. This engine doesn't have a cam angle sensor at all. Could we add one of those in? Maybe, but that's way above and beyond the scope of what I can do right now. So that's the only plausible explanation as to why it wouldn't let us choose Coil Unplug. And because of that, we are going to have to go back to using wasted spark. So we'll still get to use the individual coils, and we'll still have a more powerful coil and a much stronger spark than we used to. And we will still have the ability to run spark cut on the limiters, but we will still have to use wasted spark, which means it still will have the additional spark on a exhaust stroke pairing up with a compression stroke. And that kind of isn't a huge deal. It's still going to have its iconic sound at this point if we do that. And basically, at this point, I need to completely start over. I'm keeping this footage. I took a ton of footage of this project and everything because, I don't know, it feels stupid to have recorded all of that and not do anything with it. But everything in this whole video basically was to get to this point of, oh, by the way, you can't do this. And that's part of it. That's part of messing with these kind of experimental setups. This isn't even an off-the-shelf computer. This is a Megasquirt, do-it-yourself build computer, and this stuff is like half open source, half not, and there's not a ton of documentation out there on it. It's a lot of this is going in, experimenting, figuring it out on your own. So, figured out that this isn't going to work. I'm going to start from the beginning. I'm going to have to reconfigure the pins in the ECU. I'm going to have to build a new harness because the coils are going to have different control now. And I need 2 new coils. By the way, you want to see what a good melt it did? Melty. So that's it. End of video. Not really a win, but we learned something.